corridor of the abandoned Imperial outpost stretched into darkness, their cold durasteel walls echoing with the distant creaks and groans of the decaying structure. Lieutenant Mara Jax could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her as she led her squad through the dimly lit passageways. The mission had been straightforward: investigate the sudden loss of contact with the research station on Korriban, a barren world steeped in ancient Sith history. Yet from the moment they had set foot on the planet, something had felt wrong. As they descended deeper into the bowels of the facility, the atmosphere grew colder, and the silence became oppressive. Mara's team, seasoned veterans of countless battles, moved with a quiet tension, their usual banter absent. The outpost had been left in perfect condition, too perfect. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, no blood, just empty corridors and darkened rooms, as if the entire staff had simply vanished. "Stay sharp," Mara whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Her own heart pounded in her chest, a steady drumbeat of unease. They entered what appeared to be a central command room, a wide space dominated by a large, flickering holomap of the surrounding sector. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed by their presence. The consoles round the room were all active, screens filled with streams of data, but there were no personnel, no signs of life at all. "Mara, over here," called Sergeant Dorn, his voice tight with concern. He was standing by a console near the far wall, the glow of the screen casting eerie shadows across his face. Mara approached, glancing at the display. Her stomach turned as she read the data. "They were experimenting with something here," Dorn said, his voice hushed. "Something to do with the dark side." "That's impossible," Mara replied, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. The Empire had always dabbled in things they didn't fully understand, trying to harness the power of the Force for their own ends. The screen detailed experiments involving ancient Sith artifacts, attempts to tap into the raw power of the dark side. But there was something else: reports of strange occurrences among the staff, hallucinations, voices whispering in the dark. And then the final log entry abruptly cut off. "It's here. We've unleashed—" A sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. The team spun around, weapons raised, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty room. But Mara felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, seeping into her mind. She blinked, and for a moment, she wasn't in the room anymore. She was standing on a battlefield, bodies strewn around her, the air thick with the stench of death. She could hear the screams of the dying, feel the heat of the blaster fire, but it was wrong. The faces of the dead were familiar, her squad lying in the dirt, lifeless eyes staring back at her. She blinked again, and she was back in the command room, her heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked around. Her squad was still there, but something had changed. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Something was coming. "Mara, are you all right?" Dorn asked, concern etched on his face. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear gnawing at her insides. But before she could answer, the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, impossible footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Mara's hand tightened around her blaster, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she stood her ground, forcing herself to focus. She reached out with her senses, trying to locate the source of the noise, but all she could feel was a void, a yawning emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. Suddenly, the lights flared back on, and they were no longer alone. Figures stood in the shadows, barely visible, their faces obscured by darkness. Mara's heart skipped a beat as she realized they weren't just any figures. They were dressed in Imperial uniforms, her squad mates. But something was wrong with them. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and their expressions were twisted into ghastly grins. Dorn raised his blaster, but before he could fire, the figures vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in the air. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered, but Mara couldn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that those things had been more than just hallucinations. "We need to get out of here," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Now," but as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The sound reverberated through the room, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves.